The morning air hung heavy with the promise of a long day. At the airport, where the world felt like it moved just a touch faster than anywhere else, Evan Carter navigated the bustling terminal with a steady, unhurried pace. He carried no entourage, no telltale signs of his wealth, just a well-worn leather briefcase and a quiet presence. At 62, his neatly combed salt and pepper hair and unassuming gray suit gave the impression of a retired teacher. Perhaps. Or a man visiting distant family. This was how Evan preferred it. Over the years, he had grown weary of the attention that often followed his name. A billionaire by fortune, but a modest man by nature, he found solace in blending into the crowd. His success, though immense, was not something he wore like a badge, it was a private story. Built on hard work, resilience, and an enduring sense of fairness. The first-class cabin greeted him with soft lighting and the muted hum of an airline preparing for takeoff. Evan stepped inside, his gaze drifting over the familiar tableau of plush leather seats and impeccably dressed passengers. There was a quiet luxury to it all, the kind that didn't shout but whispered its exclusivity. Evan nodded politely to a young couple seated near the front, their eyes darting up from their screens to offer a hesitant smile in return. He appreciated the simplicity of these small exchanges, a kindness shared without pretense. As he placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, he caught sight of the flight attendant moving toward him. Emily Langford, her name tag read, neatly pinned to the crisp white of her uniform. She was in her late 30s, with sharp features that seemed to mirror her precision. Her movements were deliberate, each step practiced, each gesture polished. Yet, as her gaze settled on Evan, there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a flicker of something that didn't quite fit the image of warmth she projected moments earlier. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone professional but clipped. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin? The economy section is just behind." Evan looked at her, his expression calm, almost curious. "I believe this is my seat," he replied evenly, gesturing toward the boarding pass in his hand. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, her smile tightening at the corners. "May I see your ticket, please?" There it was, the quiet sting of being doubted. A sensation Evan had felt countless times before. He handed over the ticket without protest. His hands steady, his face betraying nothing. Around them, the murmur of conversation had faded, replaced by the pointed silence of onlookers pretending not to notice. Emily scrutinized the ticket, holding it up to the light as if searching for a flaw. When she handed it back, there was a faint flush of embarrassment in her cheeks, though her tone remained firm. "It seems everything is in order. Mr. Carter, welcome aboard." Evan nodded, sliding into his seat without a word. The interaction, though brief, lingered in the air like a faint but persistent odor. He could feel the weight of unspoken judgments pressing against him, not just from Emily, but from others in the cabin. The polite indifference they had offered moments earlier now felt like a thin veil, barely concealing their curiosity, or perhaps their discomfort. As the plane filled, Evan turned his attention to the window, watching the ground crew below move with the same efficiency that had once defined his own rise in the world. He thought about how much had changed since those early days when he couldn't afford a bus ticket, let alone a first-class seat. And yet, some things remained stubbornly the same. He sighed quietly, pulling a book from his briefcase. The words on the page blurred for a moment as his thoughts wandered. It wasn't the questioning itself that troubled him, it was the pattern. The small, subtle ways people revealed their assumptions. He had lived long enough to know that these moments often carried more weight than outright hostility. They were like drops of water against stone, eroding trust, piece by piece. Across the aisle, Emily continued her pre-flight routine, her interactions with other passengers light and efficient. Yet, Evan couldn't help but notice how her demeanor shifted depending on who she was speaking to. With the sharply dressed man in row 2, she was warm, almost deferential. With the older woman struggling to stow her carry-on, her patience was thinner, her words brisk. It was subtle, almost imperceptible if you weren't paying attention. But Evan had learned to notice these things not just as a man of color, but as someone who believed deeply in the power of fairness and dignity. He had spent his life building something better, something that tried, however imperfectly, to rise above these quiet failings. And now, sitting in the soft leather of a first-class seat, he wondered if all his work had been enough. The engines roared to life. A low vibration spreading through the cabin. Evan settled back into his seat, closing his eyes as the plane began its ascent. Above the clouds, he thought, perhaps there would be room to breathe, to leave behind the weight of assumptions and the quiet, persistent hum of judgment. But he knew, deep down, that the challenges of this flight were only beginning. The journey ahead, both in the air and beyond, promised to be anything but smooth. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane taxied toward the runway, casting a muted glow over the passengers. Evan Carter adjusted his seatbelt, glancing briefly at the flight attendant's practiced gestures as she demonstrated the safety instructions. The voice over the intercom was calm, almost soothing, as it outlined the procedures no one hoped to need. Evan leaned back, letting the words wash over him. For a moment, there was peace, a fragile bubble of stillness amid the faint rustling of newspapers and the soft hum of the engines. But that peace would not last long. As the plane ascended, climbing steadily into the overcast sky, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, a change in the rhythm of Emily Langford's movements as she made her way down the aisle. A flicker of hesitation when her eyes landed on Evan. She carried herself with a practiced poise, but there was a tension beneath it, a tightness in the way she adjusted her tray and set down the drinks. Evan noticed it. He always noticed. When Emily returned to his row, her smile had thinned into something perfunctory. "Would you like something to drink, Mr. Carter?" she asked, the formality in her tone just slightly overdone, as though she were compensating for something unspoken. "Water, please," Evan replied, his voice even. He kept his gaze steady but kind, offering no reason for her to bristle, no excuse for the discomfort he sensed in her. Emily nodded, setting the water down with a touch more force than necessary before turning to the next passenger. Evan exhaled quietly, picking up his book again. But his focus wavered. The interaction was nothing overt, nothing that would warrant attention from the passengers around him. And yet, it lingered, a faint whisper of a larger truth. It was the kind of moment that had followed Evan throughout his life. No raised voices, no pointed accusations, just a quiet, persistent questioning of his place. Whether it was in the boardroom or the first-class cabin, the message was often the same. "Do you belong here?" Evan turned the page, his eyes scanning the words without truly absorbing them. He thought about the days when such questions had burned hot in his chest. The sting of them raw and unrelenting. Time had dulled that edge, but it had not erased the pattern. And now, as the plane leveled out and the hum of conversation filled the cabin once more, the pattern was there again, quietly asserting itself. It wasn't long before the murmurs in the cabin were replaced by a different kind of noise. Somewhere near the front of the plane, a commotion had begun, a sharp intake of breath, a muffled cry, heads turned, passengers shifting in their seats to get a better view. Evan craned his neck, catching sight of an older man slumped in his seat, his face pale and damp with sweat. "Is there a doctor on board?" Emily's voice carried through the cabin, sharp and urgent now, stripped of its earlier stiffness. She stood frozen for a moment, scanning the faces of the passengers as though the answer might leap out at her. Evan rose instinctively, his book forgotten. He wasn't a doctor, but his years of experience in leadership had taught him the value of stepping in when others hesitated. "I can help," he said, his voice calm but firm. Emily's eyes landed on him, her expression unreadable for a beat too long. "Are you?" she began, then stopped herself, her hesitation as loud as any words she might have said. "I'm a trained pilot," Evan offered, his tone patient. "I've had emergency response training. I can assist until we find a medical professional." For a moment, it seemed as though Emily might object. Her gaze flicked to his simple suit, his unassuming demeanor, the things that didn't quite fit her expectations. But the urgency of the situation won out. She stepped aside, allowing him access to the aisle. Evan moved quickly, his focus narrowing as he knelt beside the man in distress. The details of the man's condition came into sharp relief: the shallow breaths, the faint pulse, the sheen of perspiration on his brow. He spoke softly to the man, his voice steady and reassuring. While another passenger retrieved the first aid kit, the cabin fell silent, the earlier hum of conversation replaced by the tension of collective worry. Evan worked methodically, his hands moving with the precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. He wasn't a doctor, but he was calm, anchored in the knowledge that calm could be the difference between chaos and resolution. Behind him, Emily stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her earlier doubt hung in the air like a shadow, unnoticed by most but unmistakable to Evan. He didn't look back at her. There was no time for that now. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor came forward from the rear of the plane. Together, they stabilized the man until the situation was under control. Evan stepped back, letting the doctor take over, and returned to his seat without fanfare. His heart beat steadily in his chest. His breathing measured, but there was a heaviness in his shoulders. A weight he knew well. Emily approached him moments later, her expression guarded. "Thank you for stepping in," she said, her voice quieter now, more subdued. Evan met her gaze, his face unreadable. "Of course," he replied, his tone as steady as ever. He didn't say what lingered at the edges of the moment, what neither of them would acknowledge outright. The question of how different things might have been if he hadn't spoken up. If he hadn't insisted on being seen. The cabin settled back into an uneasy quiet, the passengers resuming their conversations in hushed tones. Evan picked up his book once more, though he knew he wouldn't read a word of it. He stared out the window instead, his reflection faint against the clouds. The world above the clouds was supposed to feel weightless, free from the burdens of what lay below. But Evan knew better. Even here, at 35,000 feet, the weight of assumptions followed him, clinging to every interaction, every glance. As the flight continued, Evan allowed himself a small, quiet thought. Perhaps, just this once, his actions had made the weight just a little lighter. But the journey was far from over for Emily, for the airline, and for the world they both inhabited. The flight landed smoothly, as if the tension of the preceding hours had evaporated in the descent. Passengers murmured their relief, the unease of the earlier medical emergency dissipating into polite applause for the pilots. Evan Carter remained seated as the cabin lights brightened, allowing the rush of those eager to disembark to pass him by. He watched the others' heads bent over phones, bags pulled from overhead bins, children clutching stuffed animals. The man who had collapsed during the flight was now being escorted out by paramedics, his pale face showing signs of recovery. Evan felt a quiet relief but stayed unnoticed in the shadows of the moment, content to let his contribution go unspoken. As the last few passengers filed out, Emily Langford lingered near the galley, her polished demeanor cracking ever so slightly. Her usual confidence was replaced by a strained energy, a stiffness in her movements that hinted at the turmoil beneath. She avoided Evan's gaze but glanced his way more than once, as though the weight of their earlier interactions was finally settling on her shoulders. Evan, for his part, was still. He had learned over the years that the most powerful statements were often made in silence. Yet he couldn't help but feel the threads of tension weaving through the air between them, threads spun from assumptions and regrets. Misunderstandings that were as much societal as personal. The terminal felt cavernous as Evan stepped into it, the polished floors reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights. He moved with the same unhurried pace that had carried him through the morning, his well-worn briefcase swinging gently at his side. The anonymity of the airport was comforting, a reminder that here, he was just another traveler. But his mind lingered on the flight, on Emily's hesitation and the way her voice had trembled when she finally thanked him. It wasn't an apology, at least. Not in words, but it carried the weight of one. He wondered if she recognized the deeper layers of her behavior, the biases that had colored her initial treatment of him. Evan wasn't angry. He hadn't been for a long time. Instead, there was a quiet sadness, a familiar ache that surfaced whenever these moments reminded him of the world's unspoken rules. He had spent decades navigating them, rising above them, and yet they still found him. Even here, in the supposed neutrality of an airplane cabin. For Emily, the aftermath was less serene. As she exited the plane and made her way to the crew lounge, she felt the tightness in her chest that she had managed to suppress throughout the flight. The uniformed attendants milling about greeted her with nods and polite smiles. But Emily could barely respond. Her mind was too full. She replayed the encounter with Evan in her head. The way he had stepped forward when others hesitated. His calm authority in the face of her doubt. She thought about the pause before she let him through, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to betray her unease. It wasn't the first time Emily had acted on instinct, assuming someone didn't belong, and if she were honest with herself, it probably wouldn't have been the last. Except now. She couldn't shake the discomfort that followed. She had been wrong. Worse, she had been unfair. Sitting in the break room, Emily folded her hands tightly in her lap. She had spent years perfecting the art of professionalism, priding herself on her ability to maintain the high standards of first class. Yet, today, that pride felt misplaced, heavy in a way she hadn't anticipated. When her supervisor entered the room, clipboard in hand, Emily straightened instinctively. "Good flight?" he asked. His tone casual. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to brush it off, to say yes and move on. But the words stuck in her throat. There was an incident, she finally admitted. A passenger had a medical emergency. Her supervisor nodded, jotting something down. "Handled well?" "Yes," she replied, though her voice faltered. "A passenger, Mr. Carter, stepped in to help." There was no need to elaborate. She didn't mention the hesitation, the moment of doubt that had colored her every interaction with Evan. It wasn't part of the official story. But as her supervisor moved on, Emily remained rooted to the spot, the echoes of her unspoken words filling the silence around her. For Evan, the next few days unfolded in quiet reflection. Back in his office, overlooking the city from a modest but comfortable chair, he reviewed reports from the airline. The numbers spoke of profits and efficiency, of schedules met and passenger satisfaction surveys. But Evan's mind was elsewhere. He thought about the ways small moments revealed larger truths. How the assumptions of a single individual could reflect the culture of an entire organization. His own experience was not unique, it was simply another thread in a vast tapestry of inequities, woven over years and reinforced by silence. Evan's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. The message was from one of his senior advisors, confirming what he already knew. The acquisition of the airline was final. He was now its owner, its steward, responsible not just for its profits but for its culture. The thought was sobering. Change, he knew, would not come easily. It never had. But as he leaned back in his chair, Evan allowed himself a moment of quiet determination. He would not let this opportunity pass. The airline and the people within it could be better. And perhaps, so could Emily Langford. Emily, unaware of the shifts happening at the highest levels, continued her routine in the days that followed. But there was a tension in her that hadn't been there before. A nagging voice that questioned her every move. She began noticing things she hadn't before, the way she instinctively smiled more at certain passengers. The way her tone shifted when she felt out of her depth. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, that she was simply tired. But deep down, she knew better. There was something she needed to confront. A truth she had avoided for too long. And so, as Emily prepared for her next flight, she resolved to face it not with grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but in the small, quiet choices she made each day. It was, she thought, a beginning. The corporate training room was smaller than Emily Langford expected. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above rows of folding chairs, their sterile glow reflecting off the muted beige walls. She adjusted her uniform as she stepped inside, noting the other employees already seated. Most were flight attendants like herself, though a few wore the business casual attire of ground staff. No one looked particularly eager to be there. Emily chose a seat near the back, her movements deliberate, her face carefully neutral. She glanced at the glossy handouts placed on each chair, cultural sensitivity and empathy in customer service. The words sat heavily on the page, as though daring her to react. A man in his 40s, neatly dressed with an air of practiced authority, stepped to the front of the room. "Good morning," he began, his voice even. "My name is Jason, and I'll be leading today's session. I know trainings like this can sometimes feel uncomfortable, even unnecessary, but I want to assure you, this is not about placing blame. It's about understanding. Emily's stomach tightened. The word blame echoed in her mind. Even as Jason moved on to discuss the agenda, she had told herself this session was just another box to check. Another protocol to follow. But as the minutes ticked by, she found herself sitting straighter, the edge of her chair pressing against her legs. The first exercise seemed harmless enough. Jason asked the group to describe moments when they had felt othered. When they had been treated differently because of how they looked, where they came from, or who they were. There was an awkward pause, followed by hesitant voices. A young man in the front row spoke first. I grew up in a small town, he said, his voice steady but soft. I was the only Latino kid in my school. People would always ask if my parents were legal. It didn't matter that we'd lived there longer than most of them. A murmur ran through the room. Emily shifted in her seat, her gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't need to look up to know that others were nodding in understanding. Another voice chimed in, this one belonging to a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair. I'm a gate agent, she said, and when passengers get upset, they'll sometimes tell me to get someone in charge. As if I couldn't possibly be that person. The stories came faster now, each one exposing a sliver of vulnerability. Emily listened, her heart pounding in her chest. These were her colleagues, people she had worked alongside for years. And yet, their experiences felt like a world apart. When Jason asked if anyone else wanted to share, Emily kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of their glances, the unspoken invitation to add her voice to the room. But what could she say? That she had been the one asking the questions, casting the doubts? The thought made her throat tighten. The second exercise hit closer to home. Jason displayed a series of scenarios on the screen's subtle interactions that invited judgment. You're at a busy restaurant, he said. 2 tables ask for the same service at the same time. One table is occupied by a group of young black men, the other by an older white couple. Who do you assist first? The room was silent. Jason didn't press for answers. He simply let the question hang, the weight of it settling over them all. Bias isn't always conscious, he continued. It can show up in split-second decisions, in the smallest of gestures. But those moments add up. They shape how people experience the world. Emily's chest ached with the weight of unspoken truths. She thought about the flight, about how she had hesitated before letting Evan Carter help. She thought about the older black woman who had struggled with her carry-on. The one Emily had ignored while rushing to assist another passenger. The memories came unbidden, sharp and unrelenting, and for the first time, she didn't try to push them away. At the end of the session, Jason asked the group to reflect on their own biases. Think about a moment when you made an assumption, he said, not out of malice, but instinct. What did that assumption cost you? What did it cost the other person? Emily's pen hovered over the page in front of her, the words refusing to form. What had her assumptions cost her? Respect, perhaps, trust. But what about those on the other side of her actions? What had her hesitation cost Evan Carter? What had her indifference cost the elderly woman? The answer was uncomfortable, but clear. It had cost them dignity. After the session, Emily lingered in the hallway, her thoughts heavy. She could hear her colleagues chatting quietly as they made their way out, their voices blending into the hum of the building. She stayed where she was, staring down at the handouts she hadn't yet put away. Emily, Jason's voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find him standing nearby, his expression calm but curious. You were quiet today. Any thoughts you'd like to share? She hesitated. For a moment, she considered brushing him off, offering a polite thank you before disappearing into the crowd. But something in his gaze held her still. I've made mistakes, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't see it before, but I think I've hurt people. Jason nodded, his expression unwavering, acknowledging that as an important step. He said, but the real work comes next. It's not just about recognizing bias, it's about changing the habits that reinforce it. Emily nodded slowly, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and resolve. She had spent so long clinging to the image of herself as someone who followed the rules, who upheld standards. But now, those standards felt hollow, their cracks laid bare by her own reflection. Later that evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table, the handouts spread out in front of her. The quiet of her apartment was almost suffocating, amplifying the questions that had taken root during the training. Who was she, really? And who did she want to be? She thought of Evan Carter again, of the calm dignity with which he had faced her doubt. She didn't know how to make things right, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't ignore it anymore. With a deep breath, Emily picked up her pen and began to write. Not a formal apology, not yet, but a promise to herself, a commitment to do better. To be better. It was a small step, but it was hers to take. Evan Carter stood at the window of his office, his gaze drifting over the city skyline. The day was overcast, the sky a flat gray that seemed to stretch endlessly. It suited his mood, a quiet restlessness that had taken hold ever since the flight. The memory of Emily Langford's hesitation, her barely concealed doubt, lingered in his mind like the faint echo of a chord left unresolved. The reports he'd received earlier that morning only deepened his thoughts. They were internal reviews, cataloging complaints from passengers and staff. Some were minor delays, misplaced baggage, but others carried a heavier weight. Stories of passengers singled out, ignored, or spoken to with a sharpness that betrayed deeper currents of bias. Evan sighed, setting the papers down on his desk. It wasn't a new problem. He had encountered it in other industries, other spaces, but here, in this airline he now owned, the problem felt more personal. He had experienced it firsthand, sitting in a seat he had every right to occupy. Emily Langford, meanwhile, was making her way through the familiar corridors of the airport, her polished heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. Her schedule had been shifted in the days following the training, placing her on unfamiliar routes with unfamiliar crews. It was a subtle sign, she realized, of the airline's scrutiny. She felt their eyes on her, the other attendants, the supervisors, even passengers seemed to glance her way with an edge of curiosity, as if they had heard whispers of her actions. It was exhausting, carrying that invisible weight, but it wasn't undeserved. Emily had spent nights replaying the incident on the flight, each detail etched sharply in her mind. The way she had questioned Evan Carter's place in first class, the pause before she stepped aside to let him assist with the medical emergency, and the look on his face, calm, steady, but tinged with something she couldn't quite name. Disappointment, perhaps. She had avoided looking too closely at herself for too long. But now, with the training still fresh in her memory, the questions were harder to ignore. How often had she acted on instinct, letting judgment slip through unnoticed? And how many passengers had left her flights feeling diminished, their dignity eroded by her assumptions? The day Emily was called into her supervisor's office, she wasn't surprised. She had been expecting it, a reckoning of some kind. What she hadn't expected was to find Evan Carter sitting there, his presence both startling and strangely fitting. He sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable. "Ms. Langford," her supervisor said, gesturing for her to sit. "We wanted to discuss an incident that occurred on a recent flight." Emily's throat tightened as she lowered herself into the chair. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. Evan spoke then, his voice low and measured. "This isn't about assigning blame," he began. "It's about understanding. I'd like to hear your perspective on what happened." For a moment, Emily couldn't find the words. She glanced at her supervisor, then back at Evan, whose gaze remained fixed on her. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of the indignation she might have expected. But there was something else, an intensity that made it clear this conversation mattered. I made assumptions," she admitted finally, her voice quiet but firm. "About you, about where you belonged." Evan nodded, his expression unchanged. "And why do you think that is?" The question hung in the air, its weight pressing down on her. She thought about the training session, about Jason's words. Bias isn't always conscious. It can show up in the smallest of gestures. She thought about her upbringing, her years in a community where everyone looked like her, thought like her. "I think," she began slowly, choosing her words with care, "that I've been operating on habits I never questioned. Habits that come from assumptions I grew up with." It was the closest she had come to saying it out loud to naming the thing that had shadowed her actions for so long. Racism. Not the loud, overt kind she had seen in history books, but the quiet, insidious kind that nestled in the corners of everyday life. Evan didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost contemplative, acknowledging that is important. But acknowledgement alone isn't enough. What matters is what comes next. In the weeks that followed, Emily was given a new assignment. She would participate in a pilot program designed to improve the airline's customer service culture. The program included additional training, mentoring sessions, and opportunities to lead workshops for her peers. It wasn't framed as a punishment, though Emily couldn't help but feel it as one. Instead, it was presented as a chance for her to grow, to be part of something larger than her own redemption. Evan oversaw the program from a distance, receiving regular updates. He read the reports on Emily's progress, noting both her successes and the moments where she faltered. There were times when her defensiveness crept back in, her old habits tugging at her. But there were also moments, small but significant, when she showed real effort. Real awareness. One such moment came during a feedback session with passengers. An elderly black woman spoke about an experience that mirrored Emily's behavior on the flight: the subtle dismissiveness, the lack of acknowledgement. Emily listened quietly, her expression unreadable. But when it was her turn to speak, she didn't deflect or make excuses. "I've made those same mistakes," she admitted, "and I'm trying to do better." It wasn't a perfect response, but it was an honest one. Evan, reading about it later, allowed himself a small measure of hope. For Emily, the journey was far from over. She still carried the weight of her past actions, the knowledge that she had contributed to the quiet erosion of dignity for too many passengers. But as she stood before her peers during one of the workshops, sharing her story for the first time, she felt something shift. It wasn't redemption, not yet. But it was a beginning. The room was silent as she spoke, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've learned that bias doesn't just hurt the people we direct it toward. It also limits us. It narrows our understanding, our compassion, and I don't want to live that way anymore." In the back of the room, Evan watched her, his expression thoughtful. He knew the road ahead would be long for Emily, for the airline, for the countless others who would one day benefit from the changes they were working to build. But for now, this was enough. A single step forward in a journey that could not be measured by miles, but by the quiet resolve to do better. The conference room was quiet except for the soft hum of the projector. Light from the windows slanted across the polished table, where a group of airline staff sat in attentive silence. Emily Langford was among them, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She tried to appear composed, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. At the front of the room stood Evan Carter, his presence understated yet commanding. He wasn't the sort of man who demanded attention, but it was difficult not to notice him. His calm demeanor carried a gravity that made people listen, even when he spoke softly. "This company," Evan began, his voice steady, "is built on the trust of its passengers. That trust is earned not just by getting them to their destinations safely, but by how they're treated along the way." His words hung in the air, unembellished but profound. Emily felt their weight as she sat among her colleagues, each of them undoubtedly reflecting on their role in that trust or lack of it. "We've all made mistakes," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Some of them unintentional, born out of habits or assumptions we've never questioned. But acknowledging those mistakes isn't where the work ends. It's where it begins." Emily shifted in her seat, her pulse quickening. She had heard variations of this message during the training sessions, but hearing it from Evan, knowing what had happened between them, made it resonate differently. Later that afternoon, as the group began to disperse, Emily found herself lingering. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the gnawing sense that something remained unresolved, or perhaps it was the quiet pull of Evan's presence. Either way, when the others had gone, she stayed behind. Evan was gathering his materials when he noticed her. He paused, his expression unreadable, and gestured for her to come closer. Emily hesitated, then walked toward him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "I just wanted to thank you for what you said today. It It really hit home. Evan studied her for a moment. His eyes calm but searching. I'm glad it resonated, he said simply. Emily nodded, though the words she truly wanted to say felt stuck in her throat. She thought about the flight. About the moments when her instincts had betrayed her better self. She wanted to apologize, to explain, but no explanation felt sufficient. Ms. Langford, Evan said, breaking the silence. Do you remember a flight a few months ago? First class. A medical emergency? Emily's breath caught. Of course. She remembered. The memory of that flight had haunted her ever since. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I do. Evan leaned back slightly, folding his hands. That was my flight. The words struck her like a physical blow. Emily's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. You were... She couldn't finish the sentence. The realization hit her all at once. The pieces snapping into place with a clarity that made her stomach churn. I was the passenger you questioned, Evan said, his tone steady but firm. The one whose ticket you doubted. The one you hesitated to let help. Emily's face burned with shame. Mr. Carter, she began, her voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't realize. That's the point. He interrupted gently. You didn't know. And you didn't need to know. My worth, my place in that cabin, wasn't contingent on you understanding who I was. The truth of his words cut through her like a blade. She felt exposed. Every defense she had carefully built crumbling in the face of his quiet honesty. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I was wrong. I see that now. Evan nodded, his expression softening slightly. I know you're sorry, he said, and I believe you mean it. But this isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who've been on the receiving end of those same assumptions. Those same doubts. Emily's shoulders sagged, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She thought about the passengers she had overlooked. The ones she had dismissed without a second thought. Their faces blurred together in her mind. A collective reminder of the harm she had caused. I want to do better, she said finally, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. I don't want to be that person anymore. Evan regarded her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then he nodded. Good. Because change doesn't happen in an instant. It's something you have to commit to every day. Over the next several weeks, Emily threw herself into her work with a new sense of purpose. She attended every training session, volunteered for every workshop. She shared her story openly, though it was never easy. Each time, she felt the sting of her past actions anew. But she also felt the faint stirrings of something else, hope. Evan watched her progress from a distance, tracking her journey not with judgment but with cautious optimism. He knew the road to change was never linear. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, but he also knew that Emily was trying, truly trying, to be better. One afternoon, as he reviewed the latest reports, Evan came across a note from a passenger. It was a simple comment, unadorned but powerful. The flight attendant was kind, attentive. She made me feel seen. Evan leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. It was a small victory, but it mattered, because in the quiet moments of reflection, in the everyday choices that went unseen, real change was beginning to take root. And that, Evan thought, was worth everything. The training room was quiet save for the low murmur of conversation as a new group of employees trickled in. Emily Langford stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, steady but not rigid. She had been in this position before speaking to others, leading discussions, but this moment felt different. This time, it wasn't just about policies or procedures. It was about something deeper, something personal. As the last of the trainees settled into their seats, Emily took a breath and began. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Langford. I'm here to talk with you about something we all carry, whether we recognize it or not, our biases. Her voice was calm, measured, and the room stilled as her words found their mark. I want to start by sharing a story, she said. It's not an easy story to tell, but it's important. She paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment. The faces before her, a mix of curiosity and polite attention, reminded her of her own hesitance not so long ago, how she had resisted looking inward. resisted the discomfort of change. A few months ago, she began. I was working a flight. It started like any other day. The passengers boarded, the cabin filled, and everything seemed normal. But then I made a mistake that wasn't loud or obvious, but one that carried more weight than I realized at the time. She described the moment when she had questioned Evan Carter's ticket, her hesitation in allowing him to assist with the medical emergency. She spoke not of excuses but of the assumptions that had guided her actions. Assumptions she hadn't questioned until they were laid bare before her. I didn't stop to think about what my hesitation said to him, she admitted. To everyone watching, I didn't think about how my actions, no matter how small, could strip someone of their dignity. In the back of the room, Evan Carter stood silently, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. He had come to observe, not to intervene. As Emily spoke, he noted the way her voice remained steady, the way she allowed her vulnerability to shine through. It was a far cry from the defensive woman he had encountered on that flight. Emily continued, her gaze sweeping the room. When I realized the harm I'd caused, I felt ashamed, but shame alone doesn't change anything. I had to do the work, hard, uncomfortable work, to confront my biases and learn how to move forward. She glanced down at her hands for a moment, collecting her thoughts. That's why I'm here today. Not because I've fixed everything about myself, but because I'm still learning. And I want to help all of us learn together. The trainees listened, their expressions shifting as her words sank in. Some nodded in quiet agreement, while others looked thoughtful, their brows furrowed. One young woman raised her hand. How do you even begin to change something so ingrained? She asked. Emily met her gaze and offered a small smile. You start by noticing, she said, by paying attention to the little moments when your instincts take over. Ask yourself why you reacted the way you did. What assumptions did you make? And where did they come from? It's not about blaming yourself, it's about understanding. Another trainee, a man in his early 30s, spoke up. But what if we mess up? What if we get it wrong? Emily nodded, her tone gentle. You will get it wrong. We all do. The important thing is what you do afterward. Own your mistakes. Apologize when necessary. And use those moments to grow. As the session drew to a close, Emily felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. She had shared her story, not for sympathy or redemption, but to spark reflection in others. As the trainees filed out, a few lingered to speak with her, their questions thoughtful, their gratitude sincere. You've given me a lot to think about. One of them said, thank you for being honest. Emily smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. Thank you for listening, she replied. That's where it all begins. Evan approached her after the room had emptied, his steps unhurried. That was well done, he said, his tone warm but reserved. Emily turned to face him, her posture still straight, but there was a softness in her expression. Thank you, she said. It feels good to share it, to own it. Evan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. You're not just sharing a story, he said. You're showing others what it means to grow. That's no small thing. She looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her. I couldn't have done this without the chance you gave me, she said quietly. Evan's smile was faint but genuine. Second chances only matter if you make them count. And you have. That evening, as Emily sat alone in her apartment, she reflected on how far she had come and how far she still had to go. Change wasn't a destination, she realized. It was a journey, one she would continue every day. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the darkening sky. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt something like peace. She couldn't undo the past, but she could shape the future. And that, she thought, was more than enough. The auditorium was bathed in the soft glow of afternoon light, streaming through tall windows and pooling onto the polished wooden floor. Rows of airline employees, pilots, flight attendants, ground staff, and executives filled the space, their murmured conversations creating a low, steady hum. On the stage at the front of the room, Evan Carter stood behind a podium, scanning the crowd with an expression that was both thoughtful and composed. The gathering was the culmination of months of quiet but deliberate change within the airline. The cultural sensitivity program had expanded. Feedback systems had been overhauled, And employees at every level were now required to engage in training sessions that challenged their assumptions and built empathy. It was a long way from finished. But today marked a moment of reflection, a chance to acknowledge what had been done and what remained. Evan adjusted the microphone, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today, we take a moment to reflect on where we've been as a company and where we're headed." The crowd quieted, their attention drawn to his calm, measured tone. "This journey hasn't been easy," he continued, "and I suspect it never will be. But the important work rarely is. What we're trying to do here isn't just about improving customer service or refining our policies. It's about creating a culture where everyone, staff and passengers alike, feels seen, respected, and valued." In the second row, Emily Langford sat with her hands folded in her lap. She listened intently, her gaze fixed on Evan. This was the first time she had been invited to such a public forum since her journey toward redemption began. She felt a mix of humility and quiet pride. It wasn't that she believed her work was done, far from it. But for the first time, she felt she was on solid ground. Evan's voice drew her attention back to the stage. "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who embodies the spirit of change we're striving for," he said. "Someone who has faced their own biases, acknowledged their mistakes, and chosen to do the hard work of growth." Emily's chest tightened as she realized he was looking at her. "Emily Langford," he said, gesturing toward her. "Would you join me on stage?" A murmur spread through the audience as Emily stood, her movements deliberate but calm. She made her way to the stage, each step echoing softly in the quiet room. When she reached Evan's side, he turned toward her with a small, encouraging smile. "Emily's story is one of transformation," Evan said, addressing the audience. "Not just personal transformation, but one that has impacted everyone around her. She has taken her experiences, both the mistakes and the lessons, and used them to lead with empathy and humility." He turned to her, his tone warm but serious. "Emily, your work reminds us that change doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from small, consistent efforts, from the courage to look inward and the determination to do better." The room erupted in applause, the sound reverberating through the space. Emily felt her cheeks flush. But she met Evan's gaze and nodded, grateful for his words. When the applause subsided, Emily stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady as she spoke, though the emotion behind her words was unmistakable. "I don't think I'll ever stop learning," she began, "or unlearning, for that matter. What I've come to understand is that the assumptions we carry about others, about the world, are often invisible to us. But that doesn't mean they aren't causing harm." She paused, letting her words settle. "I've hurt people with my assumptions. I can't take back what I've done. But I can take responsibility for it. And I can commit to being better, not just for myself, but for everyone I interact with." Her gaze swept the crowd, lingering on faces she recognized and those she didn't. "The work we're doing as a company isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about choosing to see one another not as categories or stereotypes, but as people." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, a few people began to clap. The applause grew, steady and heartfelt, until the room was filled with its warmth. After the event, as the crowd dispersed, Evan found Emily standing near the back of the auditorium, speaking quietly with a few colleagues. When she saw him, she excused herself and approached, her expression thoughtful. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, though there was no reproach in her tone. "I did," Evan replied. "Your story matters, Emily. People need to see what growth looks like, not just the outcome, but the process." She nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and determination. "I won't let you down." Evan smiled faintly. "I know you won't." That evening, as Emily walked through the quiet streets toward her apartment, she reflected on the day. The applause, the recognition, it was humbling. But it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the choice she made every day to confront her biases, to approach each interaction with a little more awareness, a little more kindness. Above her, the sky was beginning to darken, the first stars flickering faintly in the distance. She thought of Evan's words, of the journey they were all on, not just as individuals, but as a collective. The work was far from over. But that was okay. Change, she realized, wasn't a destination. It was a way of being. As she turned the corner to her building, Emily allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace, not because she had finished her work, but because she had finally begun.